Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House, political leader and intellectual leader of American conservatism and more than American conservatism. Let's talk about the world. It's this year, 2015, is 70 years after the end of World War II, 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we're speaking just a couple of days before September 11th, 14 years after an attack on the U.S. You've thought a lot about this. What do you make of the world we're in?
Well, I think, first of all, we underestimate how much the world affects us. And I think that you have forces on the move all across the planet that are going to make the next 10 or 15 years very complicated. And I think, actually, we don't have the right language to describe what we're faced with. And our very words get us, and make it very hard to do policy. I mean, the current Syrian refugee case is a perfect example. These are not refugees in the classic sense. This is a population on the move, almost in the late Roman Empire sense of populations pouring out of Central Asia. 20% of Syria is now on the move. Now, if that were happening in this country, that would be 60 million people. And the idea that Europe is somehow going to absorb everybody in Africa who would like to have a better life and absorb everybody in the Middle East who would like to not be killed, you'll see the collapse of the European system over the next few years if they continue to have this kind of mindless openness and a sense of being guilt-ridden. For reasons I don't understand. I mean, nobody in Europe caused the chaos of Syria or the chaos of Libya, and I don't understand why they believe they should be browbeaten by the news media into undertaking policies that are unsustainable.
And what about us? I mean,
Well, we have a similar problem, although we've gotten steadily, despite Obama's rhetoric, we've gotten steadily tougher about the border. We are taking step by step, and I think there's a growing awareness in the U.S. that, when you look at the Gallup World Poll, in which something like 120 million people said they would like to move to the U.S.,
right.
Only 6 million of them, by the way, from Mexico, so we can, take care of that issue. But 120 million people, and if you walked around and said, do you really think you could accept 1/3 the population of the U.S.? And if they came, they'd all write home and say, this is cool. So you'd next year have another 120 million people who would now have a right to move because, after all, my sister's there. I think this is something we got to really think about at length. I am for immigration. I think immigrants are a key to our future, but I think it has to be controlled. It has to be people who want to be assimilated, people who want to learn English, people who want to get a job. And I think that what we're currently seeing, much worse in Europe than here, because the European system is dramatically more oriented towards welfare. So you arrive in Europe, you have a reasonable grounds to say, I'm going to be taken care of.
But it sounds as if you don't think the 21st century will be, or should be, I guess, a century of decreased emphasis on national sovereignty, greater internationalization of everything. I mean, that either analytically or normatively. Is that? I mean,
a few years ago, I co-chaired a United Nations Reform Task Force with former Democratic Majority Leader George Mitchell. And after several years of looking at the UN, I can report to you that it is sufficiently corrupt and sufficiently inefficient that no reasonable person would put faith in it. I mean, if somebody said to you, the UN is going to come protect your neighborhood, would be a really good argument for moving, because they're incapable. You look at the United Nations involvement with rape, for example, in the Congo. Look at the times the United Nations has stood to one side while people have been slaughtered because the technical circumstances make it impossible to intervene. And you have to say, well, then why would you send a United Nations peacekeeping force that can't keep peace? So I think we have to confront a lot of this internationalism as people like John Kerry, who love going from four-star hotel to four-star hotel to have gourmet dinners discussing big ideas with their peers, who are also very sophisticated people. And they float in this fantasy world that has almost no resemblance to what's actually happening.
And so the nation state can be strong, but also not xenophobic, I suppose, and not lead back to wars. I mean, that's the argument you always hear from EU types and UN types that,
I think there's a real difference between nationalism and xenophobia.
Right.
I mean, nationalism says, I want to protect people who are in the United States, and we are the most diverse country in the world in ethnic groups. I've once spoken at an international forum, and I said, look, I know many of you are frustrated that we seem to pay attention to your country. I said, we have a firm ground rule. we only pay attention to countries that have people living in the U.S. Unfortunately, every country on the planet has people living in the U.S. And I think so. We're very unique. We're very different in that sense. But I think we also have to recognize that there are boundaries. You can't have a borderless world in which everybody randomly gets to go to the nearest place that will raise their standard of living without having any skills, without having any work ethic, without having any commitment, and without necessarily being willing to learn to be part of that particular country. It's a growing problem. And you can see the reaction in Australia. You see the reaction in Great Britain, in Denmark, where they've actually said, "Do not send us any refugees. We don't want any more people to come in here because it has become so disruptive." Particularly if you have people come in who do not want to assimilate, who in fact want to live separately, create an enclave, and behave in ways that violate the norms of the civilization that they're joining.
Well, speaking of that, what about the threat of Islamic terrorism, radicalism, Islamism, whatever we call it? I mean, overrated, underrated? Do you think is that really the fun? I mean, I guess I would have said 20 years ago, "Oh, come on, that's not going to be really a fundamental threat in the 21st century." But I think I would have been wrong.
Well, I mean, you just illustrated why we need new words to describe a new reality. We can't. We have an administration which will not describe any of the sources of terrorism. It's very hard to design a model. When you realize that ISIS, for example, has a Twitter program and retweets about 60,000 items a day. They have an identity. They know what they're doing. Much of what they do in beheading people is either to raise money or to get recruits. Come to the Middle East and have fun.
Right.
And there is a percentage of young males in particular, but also a growing number of young females who are attracted to this kind of perverse, romanticism. You too can come and slaughter people. So you have a willful growth of people who are dedicated to defeating our civilization, who are very clear about what they're doing. And then you have Western elites who are terrified of telling the truth and keep looking for some way to rationalize it. And so finally you end up with a gunman with an AK-47 on a train from Amsterdam to Paris, and people are confused about his motives. Even though he is a Moroccan who has been in Syria and clearly thinks of himself as an Islamist who's out to kill people, to impose his way of life. And there's this constant desire by the news media and by the political elites to hide from the reality, one, that there's a worldwide movement. I mean, you have bombings in Thailand as well as you have bombings in Europe. Two, the gravest danger is that they will eventually get weapons of mass destruction. Whether that is cyber attacks, there's a Syrian cyber army that it routinely tries to penetrate the Pentagon. I mean, so we shouldn't assume that knowledge is necessarily blocked from people who are radically different than us. And there are, in fact, people from MIT who are part of ISIS. So you've got very first-rate minds with very good technical educations. You have to assume sooner or later they'll get a nuclear weapon. And they don't have to deliver it by ICBM. I mean, they just have to have a truck drive up and set it off. And it doesn't have to be fancy. It can also just be a dirty bomb, which would do a fairly large amount of damage. I think you have to take all that really seriously. And you have to recognize that despite all of the babbling about nuclear disarmament and living in a nuclear-free world, the North Koreans build more nukes every year. The Pakistanis build more nukes every year. Pakistan is a country deeply penetrated by Islamists. The Iranians probably already have a bomb. If not, they will have a bomb in the very near future. And it's very possible that the Saudis will then buy a bomb in order to compete with the Iranian bomb. So when you start looking at how dangerous the world's getting, you have to conclude that you are inevitably going to have to spend more on national security and focus more intensely on very tough decisions about how we survive in the world.
And so let's talk about that. So what are the fundamental things that we have to do that we're not doing? And do you think we've done a decent job in the last 14 years since 9/11? Kind of a poor job?
I think in terms of strategy, we've done a terrible job because neither the Bush administration nor the Obama administration has been willing to tell the truth. I mean, the fact is, this is a worldwide movement impelled by religion deeply dedicated to destroying our civilization, and requires ultimately a response that matches it and probably overmatches it. And we keep, bouncing from minor crisis to minor crisis. I mean, and so in the process, what you have is the decay of Libya, the decay of Yemen, the decay of Somalia, the decay of Syria. I mean, and as waves of people go out, a very small minority, but a significant minority, turn out to be the radicals. I mean, so if Germany accepts 800,000 Syrian refugees, my guess, and this is purely a guess, I don't have any secret data, my guess is at least 1% will be Islamist. Well, that's 8,000.
Right.
So you say cheerfully, let me open my border so we have at least 8,000 people show up who'd like to kill us. That's a fairly irrational strategy. And so I think and it's compounded from this standpoint of view of the United States. You have an Islamist challenge. You have a Chinese challenge. I mean, the Chinese are building artificial islands, surrounding the South China Sea in a way that only makes sense if you assume that they want to declare sovereignty over this enormous area. The Russians are still very dangerous. They're a weak economy, but they are a very nationalist state, and they have 5,000 or 6,000 nuclear weapons. Right. I mean, it's in some ways. So you have to design an American strategy that takes all of these kind of things into reality. And frankly, our elites have no interest in trying to do that. I mean, they're very, very worried about global warming, and they're very worried about helping refugees and about strengthening the UN as a multinational center of getting away from nations. But nobody in the Obama administration has any serious plans for Russia, China, or defeating the Islamists.
Institutionally, it seems to me, organizationally, we've done almost nothing. I guess that's what strikes me. If you think at the beginning of World War II, this massive, obviously, transformation of the military and of the industrial base in the U.S. and sudden development of all kinds of intelligence capabilities. Same sort of at the beginning of the Cold War, a little delayed, but then a big, big overhaul. Post for all of the fall of the Berlin Wall, or more importantly, perhaps post 9/11, really striking to me that the government I served in, which is 25 years ago now, it looks kind of the same. The State Department, the intelligence agencies. I'd say military probably has done a better job. But anyway, it really, I mean, you can't, don't you think it really is a little I guess that follows from your point about the elites not, in some sense, being serious about the world we are now living in.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see Congress very slowly beginning to move on this topic. I mean, beginning to think about whether it's cyber. There are two pretty good cyber bills in the House that are, I think, going to make a step in the right direction. If the Senate moves the same kind of bill this fall, that actually will be a step in the right direction. But nobody, and this is partly because there's a conspiracy of bureaucracies. Okay, we've built these huge bureaucracies which are used to doing what they want to do. Right. And so you go to them, and this is something George Shultz talked to me about many years ago, because he used to try to close the smaller U.S. consulates in Europe in order to free up resources to do more things in the third world. Well, everybody in the State Department was used to the idea that they wanted to be, they wanted to go to Strasbourg, not to Chad. Right. I mean, so that the institutional resistance to that kind of change was very profound. And I think you have the same thing here, that you in a bizarre way, it was probably an advantage that in 1938 and 1939 the military was as small as it was. Right. Because they could actually grow very rapidly into the modern world with modern equipment and modern doctrine in a way that they might not have been able to had they remained as big as they were in World War I.
And new leadership, right? And
that's right.
More with this than I do. Didn't they famously... By 1941 or two, the people running the army were would have been number 200 in the normal promotion.
Marshall retired an amazing number of senior officers who couldn't understand the modern world.
Right.
But that's even in a small army. But if you'd had a huge army, and if they'd had a lot more institutional ability to resisting, he couldn't have done it.
Right. And that is sort of our situation, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a little bit like there was a faction in the army that really hated counterinsurgency work. I mean, there was a real split with people like Petraeus saying, look, you got to learn to do this because this is the fight we're in, and people saying, yeah, but I really liked, confronting the Soviets on the German plain, and I really need lots of heavy armor. And so you get into this kind of constant tension about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And I think you've got to rethink our national strategy almost from the ground up. And you have to recognize from day one that it cannot be a singular strategy. I mean, you have to have a totally different style for China from the style you have for the Islamists, from the style you have for dealing with Russia. And that it doesn't even get us into Latin America and into Africa and other places. And that's the requirement of being a world power. That you've got to learn how to cope with complexity with a certain level of ease. And you can't play bunch ball and everybody goes to this year's crisis.
You think the public is ready for this? I mean, is the American public ready for accepting the responsibilities, whether they're financial, but also sort of in terms of the turmoil that the reorganization would impose? I mean, it does seem to me, you just step back and you look at we go through airports and the TSA. I mean, the responses have been pretty. I mean, on the one hand, we prevented a lot of terror attacks, I suppose, and that's good, and we took the fight to them, which I do think helped under the Bush administration. But I don't know. It doesn't seem like a response anything like commensurate to the threats that are coming.
Well, it's not. But again, you get into this very difficult. Take the case of Mubarak. Mubarak was, in fact, clearly a dictator. And he ran an authoritarian regime, and they had secret police, and there were lots of things going on. But he also was really very pro-American, didn't particularly want to fight with Israel, and hated the Islamists because he understood that they hated him. So you have to make a decision at some point. In World War II, for better or worse, we said, we're going to survive with Stalin because Stalin helping us beat Hitler is better than isolating Stalin and having him end up as Hitler's ally. I mean, it was very conscious. We tolerated Franco being a dictator in Spain because we had a limited ability to change the world, and we decided where to spend it. And this was when we were emerging as really a gigantic power. By 1945, we're about 50% of the world's economic activity because everybody else has been bombed. We still have limits, And so I think you have to have strategies, and you have to decide what really matters to you. And you also have to think about why is the other guy doing what he's doing. And I think that we today have a State Department which is incapable of being effective and really has to be, I think, overhauled from the ground up. I mean, you look at the negotiating with Iran, unless there was a willful desire to surrender, and they actually didn't care about any of the details because they were going to surrender no matter what, it is incomprehensible how bad the negotiation was.
Right.
I mean, you really have to ask yourself, did we actually hire adults to go and be this stupid? Because the Iranians just routinely ran over them.
Right.
And they tolerated it. It was as though the Iranians were the superpower, and we were the one pleading for something, which is the opposite of the actual balance of power in the region. So I think in that sense you've got to decide what are your priorities. You've got to stick to your priorities, and you've got to reshape the institutions until they work. And that's going to require a president who is very aggressive and who's very willing to take on the Congress. And because the Congress, in the end, defends a great deal of pork and a great deal of incompetence. I mean, as a side note, you can't explain the decay of the American space program without looking at some members of Congress who have propped up incompetent and inefficient companies because they were in their district or their state. And if we tried to go to the moon that way, we still wouldn't have gotten there.
It does. Maybe we have this kind of discussion, then you look out at the presidential campaign and congressional discussions and the general public discourse. It's not at all, to use a term I used a minute ago, commensurate with the scale of the challenges or even with real ambitions to make big changes. Space, you've been very involved in that. It seems to be an example. Occasionally someone says, gee, isn't it kind of pathetic that we can't do, it's really, I think, almost unprecedented in human history. As I understand it, we can't do in space what we did 40 years ago.
Oh, Boeing just announced.
We literally couldn't, So when else has a nation, a modern technological nation that didn't suffer some massive defeat, obviously in war or a plague or something like that, regressed on something like that? That's not supposed to happen.
No, it's a remarkable failure. And, Boeing recently announced that they are now going to build the capsule we used in the 1960s.
Yeah.
I mean, this is their next great contribution to getting to Mars, is they're going to rebuild the equivalent of the Apollo capsule. And you look at it, you think, we did that 40 years ago. I mean, what are you doing? Or 50 years ago, what are you doing? But I think it's a combination of bureaucracy, pork barrel politics in the Congress, the industrial complex that basically says we don't want any new players because we've got all the lobbyists. We know how to rig the game. Which is how you get things like the F-35, which is in any reasonable country would be an enormous scandal, grossly overpriced, grossly overweight, very ineffective as a fighter plane, not going to meet any of its goals. And I think that's the sort of thing that you're faced with, and it's part of why the public is so increasingly angry, because you have this huge mound of bureaucracy in Washington, surrounded by a mound of lobbyists who then manipulate the Congress and the executive branch in order to sustain continuing decay. And I think people get that. People understand that you look at your smartphone and you look at the speed of change, or you look at your ATM machine, or I was doing something the other day about asking an audience, when's the last time you went and found a payphone? Well, if you're the federal government, I mean, none of these adaptations have led to the kind of changes that you would have expected, and I think people expect that. But there are a couple of real inhibitions. Having run for president once and discovered how dense the system is, how hard it is. The first is that the news media covers what the news media understands. And so the reporters, if you give them a really good dissertation on a really interesting topic, and then I'll give you a real story. When I was first speaker, Hillary Clinton was involved with cattle futures, in which she had made apparently 1,000-to-1 return on her investment as a sign of the brilliance with which she'd undertaken investing. And I went to the Republican National Committee meeting, and of course we were at our high point, and people were giddy, and we'd taken over the House. And so I gave 95, and so I gave this terrific policy speech. And at the very end, they were all excited, and they were all applauding, and I thought, oh, what the hell? And so I gave a 90-second riff on cattle futures and said basically, and we're not going to back off on learning about cattle futures. And of course, the Republican crowd went crazy. And David Broder turned to Joe Gaylord, who was my sidekick, and said, so which do you think we're going to print?
Right.
And they were right. I mean, I had given them the excuse to avoid serious policy by printing something they understood. And the danger you face is, and you see it right now with the candidates going around, you can go around and make 23 great policy speeches and get zero coverage. Or you can have the right quip or the right tweet or the right Instagram, and suddenly, bam, you get a fair amount of coverage. So that's a challenge. The second challenge is that the elites describe what's possible and then say, well, that's not practical. You have to be practical. Well, the fact is, George Shultz, when he was Secretary of State, and Shultz he was one of the people I most admire in government. I mean, he'd been in the Department of Labor under Eisenhower. He had been Director of the Budget under Nixon. And he'd been Secretary of State under Reagan. I mean, an amazing background. And Shultz would always say, you go into business and you say, get X done, and somebody goes and does it. You go into government and you say, let's get Y done, and everybody studies it. But nothing quite happens. But where I think George misunderstood was that wasn't an argument for acceptance. That was an argument for rethinking our whole approach to bureaucracy. And I am very encouraged. Congressman Jeff Miller, who's chairman of the Veterans Committee in the House, just passed a bill out of the House on a bipartisan basis that allows the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to fire any bureaucrat who, in his judgment, is not serving veterans. Now, it's the first explicit, decisive break with the 1883 Civil Service Act, and begins to move you towards the idea of what would it be like if you decided you were going to have government that was manageable? Then what would that model be like? And I think that the Veterans Administration, because it involves our moral feeling about veterans, may be the break point that is emotionally powerful enough that you begin to see real change coming down the road. But we need candidates. I mean, it would be fabulous to have a campaign next year in which our side said, look, you elect me, we're going to fundamentally change the bureaucracy. And Hillary's basically saying, you elect me, and I'm going to stay with my good friends here in the bureaucracy, and let the country choose. And my guess is the country would overwhelmingly vote to change the bureaucracy.
So I have two. You've opened up two very interesting lines. One is sort of what are the key things it would take to fundamentally change a very broken governmental system, I think, both at the executive and congressional level and surrounding levels. And the other is, and since you ran for president and have, God knows, observed this closely over the decades, sort of how suited are our election campaigns to framing those issues in a way that could lead to the changes that are necessary. So I don't know which one of those you want to take first. I mean, they're related, obviously.
Well,
but
I think, first of all, we very badly need a doctrine. It's one of the great challenges to conservative think tanks is we need a doctrine for the overhaul of the entire bureaucratic structure. I was with somebody just last night who's a real expert on managing systems, and he said we really need to apply Schumpeter's creative destruction to government. Yeah. And if you did that, what would it be like, and how would you do it? And I would hope that the conservative movement over the next year or so will develop a set of initial, like the first 10 big things that the next president should do. And they should be as big as suspending the Civil Service Act. I mean, and saying we're going to set metrics, we're going to check performance. If you're not performing correctly, we're going to give you a chance to get retrained. If you fail, you're gone. I also think we have to look at the whole issue of how we hire people. You have today lifetime employment in the federal government when you have places like Facebook which review every quarter whether or not you're getting your job done. And if you look around the country, there are very few places left that have 30 and 40-year employment contracts.
Universities,
well, which is frankly a major issue we can talk about later in terms of how you reduce the cost of college education. Which is what the conservatives should say. The real solution to the student loan problem is to make college so cheap you don't have to borrow money.
Right.
And you could do that, not by doing what Hillary and Barack Obama want to do, which is let's send even more billions to prop up the bureaucracies of education, but rather, if you simply listed.
Yeah, let's stay on this for a while,
okay.
Just for 5-10 minutes, because I'm interested in this too, and I think our viewers are. Okay,
well,
so let's talk higher education. It's obviously in crisis both financially and intellectually.
Yeah, look, and the first thing is, if you go through and say, tell us what it would take to get back to the same number of bureaucrats per student that we had in 1950.
College bureaucrats,
yeah. Okay. You go to a place like the University of California system, which has been expanding the number of deans, associate deans, assistant deans, assistant to the assistant dean, right, et cetera, intern deans, secretaries to the deans. You go back and you look and say, what would it take to get back down to almost no bureaucracy? Right. I mean, why has this happened in an age when, frankly, with iPads and smartphones, you could reduce almost all the paperwork to self-administration?
Right.
Second, I think
one of the reasons is the federal government probably.
Right, but then that becomes a really good thing to say, and therefore here's the bill we need to pass in Washington to strip out all this bureaucratic requirement.
Right.
Because what we do right now is we play this game where Washington says, gee, there are too many of them, and they say, gee, you're making us do it. And nothing ever happens.
Right.
So I'd rather take both sides and say, you're right, there are too many regulations from Washington. So why don't we have a bill that eliminates the regulations and moves us to, Lamar Alexander had this the other day. He was saying if he wanted to reduce, now I'm not sure that his bill does this, but he was trying to get a bill written that would reduce the amount of information. We currently, I think, ask 100 questions for student aid. And he said you could get that down to a postcard with like 3 questions.
Right.
Who I am, my family's income, what I need to borrow, and compute everything else out from that. But it's that kind of radical slashing on the paperwork bureaucracy side. I think second, you have to recognize to what extent higher education costs mean, the student fee for the football team. I mean, and right, for other things you want to do, and people, to the degree they want to pay it, I'm for them paying it. I'm against them borrowing money to pay it, because I think that it sets up a really bad long-term lifetime finance problem.
Right.
And then the third great problem, of course, is that you now have the number of universities that are teaching nonsense and where you can only get tenure if you agree to teach nonsense is a very profound long-term challenge to the country. We're doing a piece on new words for a new reality. And one of the things we're starting with is Paul Ehrlich, who in 1966 or 1968 wrote The Population Bomb, in which he explains that Britain will probably cease to exist by 2000, that we have lost the effort to feed the human race, that at least 800 million people will die. I mean, you go through all of his predictions, none of which came true. Well, Ehrlich today is a highly regarded person. The president's science advisor co-authored a book with Ehrlich in the 70s. They belong to this cult of the limits to growth and the limits to human population, and the real problem is too many people, and and the degree to which they're factually crazy has no impact. So if you went in and said, I'd like to do a dissertation on why Paul Ehrlich is nuts,
Right.
you would be much less likely to get tenure at Stanford
Right.
than if you went in to say, I want to write a dissertation on why Ehrlich in the long run will be right, even though for the first 50 years he's been crazy. I mean, that would prove you were visionary with the appropriate ideological values.
And don't you think the possibilities of educating people online really are radically sort of impressive and could really change the way college delivers education?
I think
they're resisting that. I mean, some of them are doing a little bit of stuff, but
the key to all of that is the business community. We have somebody we study is Sebastian Thrun, who originally developed the Google self-driving car and did Google's street scene and ended up inventing a company called Udacity, the word audacity without the A. And he has invented what he calls nano courses. So it costs, I think, like $100 a month, and you can take as rapidly as you want to. A whole series of courses, for example, I think there are 9 courses on entrepreneurship. He's doing courses on computer programming. And he's now signed contracts with people like AT&T and Google that if you pass his courses, they will count them as certified.
yeah, that's the key. I mean, right?
And what it does is it allows him to sidestep the whole accreditation bureaucracy, which is designed to protect the old order. Now, the other side of that I think is going to be fascinating to watch, Harvard has put their entry-level computer course online. Yale apparently now uses the Harvard computer course because it's so powerful and so effective. And it's available to anybody in the world for free. And it hasn't quite penetrated yet that, you can really learn an enormous amount at almost no cost.
Right.
And I suspect once people begin to understand that better, now in the Udacity case, they have mentors, and they think it's very important that the mentor can be electronic, can be somebody you call. They don't have to be in your neighborhood. But they think it's very important that you have somebody you can go to
Right.
that can help you through the parts you don't quite get. That there's still a human need for coaching, but that's not the same as the professor-centric lecture model of the past.
And I think in liberal education, too, though there's still no substitute for having a great teacher sitting in a seminar room with 12 people, I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff online now that can enable an awful lot of people to get a pretty good education, free or very cheap on their own, and better than what they're getting at 98% of the colleges and universities in the U.S. You just wonder how long they can make kids at some, second or third rate school take a politically correct course on, I don't know what, I would say Western civilization, but they don't do Western civilization, so non-Western civilization, instead of listening to Don Kagan's lectures, which are free from Yale, where you would learn a ton more, and especially if they then set it up so you could have a graduate student or a teaching assistant you could talk to electronically or not, every week to, answer your questions and give you suggestions for further reading, and you would have syllabuses online that would point people to, further, as I say, further readings in these areas. It just seems like there's huge opportunities there that would both save a ton of money and actually give a lot of people much better education.
Yeah, I think in particular there's an opportunity here to reach out to precisely the people who aren't going to get to an elite school.
Right.
And to reach out to them at every level. There's a program now in Baltimore where if high school students pass a computer program, they are guaranteed a $40,000 a year job when they get out of high school. and it's aimed right at kids who have no hope for the future, no sense, and all of a sudden your kids going, for that I'll study, because they can see a direct, immediate opportunity. And I think you'll see a lot more of that sort of thing. It's been dramatically held back by three forces: the teachers' unions, who just hate this concept of fluidity and change; the classic bureaucracies, who are all really deeply threatened by this; and then the professoriate. I mean, the people who are the mandarins of our culture, who have historically bestowed status, are all panic-stricken that in fact we'll all realize the emperor has no intellectual clothing, and people will start learning in chaotic and uncontrollable ways that might lead them to not automatically become cookie-cutter left-wingers in the way that they're supposed to.
And government could really, I do think the next president could really be, it's close to a tipping point, it strikes me anyway, as you sort of said. Yeah. And if you had a Secretary of Education backed up by a president who came in determined to really see if he couldn't use really mostly the persuasive and illustrative powers of the federal government, but also some issues with accreditation and so forth,
well, I mean,
to really jab the system. I really wonder whether you couldn't have a massive transformation.
I think you could move again, it depends on whether you think your job is to get a Secretary of Education who collaborates with the education complex and is acceptable to them, or who focuses on learning in America and is happy to work with anybody who's interested in learning in America. Those are radically different definitions of the system. And one of the things which has caught the Obama Secretary of Education, who I think in some ways would like to have been more daring, is he can't get outside the teachers' unions. I mean, it's just literally impossible to survive as a Democrat and be at war with the teachers' unions.
And the higher ed complex, which is millions of people and mostly Democrats now, and he's not going to take them on in a fundamental way. No, I've thought about this since I came to Washington to work for Bill Bennett. Obviously, I was chief of staff at the education department. I think we had the right instinct, which was to take on what Bill called the education blob, and to try to think about educating young people and helping them educate themselves and helping others educate them, as opposed to serving the education complex. The technology really, in a funny way, I'd say that wasn't there probably.
That's right.
It was so hard
No, I
to,
think
in
that's
1986, 87, how did you really do that in a concrete way? Well, you pushed school choice, you defended homeschooling, you did all kinds of things, you tried to empower parents, but you still were dealing with the basic institutions.
I went, as an undergraduate at Emory, I was sent by a Republican state senator over to meet a guy named Pete Jensen at the Rich Computing Center at Georgia Tech. And I ended up basically just as a volunteer studying computing with Jensen for many years. And after I got to be a professor out of West Georgia College, I get this call one day about 1972. And he says, we have this new device, which we call ALF, ALF, for Audiographic Learning Facility. And it's going to be an online learning system. And we'll have it set up here at Tech, and we're looking for somebody who will volunteer to use it as a distance learning device. Now, 1972, you're using traditional telephone lines. You have almost no computing capacity. You are so far, your theory is so far ahead of the technology that it takes at least 30 years to catch up. And so we played around with it for about 8 months and said, and I loved the idea back then, but I said, this is a great idea. None of my students can do this. I mean,
Right.
And of course the feeding pace of information coming out of Tech was so slow on the telephone lines that were available in Carrollton, Georgia at that time. So I think you're right. Part of what's intriguing, and Bill Gates has a line about this, he says, you can never go as far in 1 year as you think you can, and you can often go dramatically further in 5 years than you think you can. And I think what's happening is that the experiential technologies of our time, that is the ability, we play around right now, for example, with the Facebook investment in virtual reality, which is a device they're trying to bring on the market for about the price of a PlayStation. And you put it on, and I mean, you are really in a virtual reality setting. And we are looking at doing some things like we're working on a film on why George Washington matters, and we're going to try to shoot a few minutes of it in virtual reality, just because we think we'll get young people intrigued just to see George Washington in a virtual reality setting.
Right.
Yeah, but none of that existed when you and Bill were working. And the other big thing, which I think all of us participated in, and, I went around on A Nation at Risk with Ted Bell and talking about the need for change. But all of us thought you could change the current education system.
Right.
And so we spent about 30 years going down a road that was hopeless because there, in Baltimore, for example, they spend something like $137,000 a year per student who passes the 8th grade exam, because so many of them fail.
Wow.
Okay, but so I was looking at, so how do you change all that? Because the Catholic schools spend $12,000 a year or $9,000 a year, and have the kid passes. And what hit me was, and I had never quantified it before, the Baltimore school system is something like a $4.2 billion system. It's the third most expensive big city school system in America. So the reformers are over here with $1 million of reform money, right, and they're faced with a multi-billion-dollar machine that wants to protect itself. And that's the sort of imbalance we've had. And so my conclusion has been that you've got to look at the Udacities of the world, the Khan Academies, places like that, and recognize that, or Duolingo, and recognize that what you've got to do is move around the fortress, because you're not going to change it, and just let it atrophy.
Yeah.
As more and more learning takes place outside it.
Yeah, the model I think you and I discussed this once, is conservatives spent an awful lot of time, and I remember as a kid reading the National Review, complaining bitterly about the United States Post Office,
Yeah.
which was a massive institution at one point. I mean, 1 million employees, unionized, inefficient, full of, just bloat, and it was kind of a considered a quintessential kind of case study in liberal government bureaucracy. And people took it on and got nowhere, basically. And then Fred Smith invented Federal Express, and then email happened, and basically the post office has shrunk and is not a huge problem in America, and probably isn't taking up nearly it's still actually taking up more resources than it should, I'm sure, and because it's sort of
no longer
it was
central.
very good example, I think, of end running,
Yeah.
but that required thinking about how to get information to people, not how to fix the post office.
Right.
And that's, I think,
And the same thing's happening, I think, with education. And if you ever get the businesses to decide that they will be directly committed to the kids, and that any kid who meets a certain standard will get a job, you will break loose both a lot of poverty, because people will now see a reason to learn, and you'll break through a lot of learning, because now you're not going to say, go over here and try to fix the school system. You're going to say, how can I deliver in the poorest neighborhood in Baltimore or the poorest neighborhood in Washington? How can I deliver learning in a way that enables them to qualify for a job? And then how can I make sure that the job intersects with the student? And that will send a change signal through the entire neighborhood, because now Freddie or Sally will actually have a job, and they'll bring home money, and that begins to change the whole signaling about the culture.
Come back to the federal government for a minute. You mentioned sort of massive civil service reform, rethinking the basic way it's been structured for 140 years or something
Right.
like that. Other thing, if one of the current presidential candidates called you, so I'm sure they do, and said, okay, what are my two other big, process, structural, institutional reforms of the federal government? Is there some obvious sort of thing that's not? Congress seems to be broken as well as the executive branch. Is there? I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, well,
They're supposed to have a budget, and
Yeah.
there's no real budget. They spend more money than they take in, and the Fed spends the money, prints the money, and it's sort of, the system is, you step back and it's kind of crazy, right? I mean, it can't be sustained.
Well, I would draw a couple of distinctions. Let me stay with the executive branch for a second. I really believe we ought to go towards a lot of prizes, and move away from this belief of an input-centered model. So we recently ran a project called Constellation, which was supposed to get us to Mars. It was badly designed. It didn't work. And when they canceled it, we had invested $9 billion. Now, if you had taken the same $9 billion and said, this is the prize for whoever gets to Mars, you have at least 7 or 8 billionaires who would, instead of buying a football team, decide they wanted to play. And you'd have a level of creativity, and you wouldn't be paying anything for the planning, the experimentation. People tend to forget that the first great transatlantic flight in 1927 is based on the Orzog Prize, which was set up in 1919, that said whoever can fly nonstop from New York to Paris gets $25,000. And lots of people were trying to solve it, and it took them 8 years to finally win it. But there was a momentum of experimentation and change that didn't, because here's the challenge you've got. McCullough has a great new book out on the Wright brothers. And Clist and I visited the Wright brothers' home in Dayton a few years ago. The Wright brothers, over a 5-year period, tried to fly 500 times. They were doing it on their own, and so they were very frugal, and it cost about $1 per flight. On December 17th, 1903, a Saturday, they get up in the morning, they make coffee, and they go out and they fail 4 times. On the 5th flight, they fly. And they've begun to figure out the breakthrough of how to get, from that point on, the curve is amazing. Well, imagine you were a congressional hearing and these guys were in the aviation bureaucracy, and they had failed 200 times.
Right.
And you'd say, what are you doing? But because they were being measured by endpoint, not by process, and because they were putting up their own money, they could go out and keep floundering until they figured it out. And so I think that there are a lot of spaces where we want to do that. The other thing
Could the U.S. government function that way, though? It's so used to being input-driven, and congressional hearings are so used to...
But historically, the British, for example, discovered the keys to navigation as a prize. The French discovered canning as a prize. Prizes were very big in the aeronautics period. When people would fly around the world and they'd fly fastest aircraft, and lots of things were done. And the prizes were important a little bit financially, but they were really important psychologically, which is why you want to engage. When you've got people who are worth between, say, $1 and $80 billion, their ability to do things where you don't have to hire 7 layers of bureaucracy, you don't have to go through, The other part of that in terms of things like space is, and I was just with Buzz Aldrin on Sunday talking about his experience on the moon, and he's very big on going to Mars. And he makes the point, you ought to have a ground rule that says it should be about as safe as climbing Mount Everest. But you can't have a standard that says it's going to be pristine. A lot of people were killed in the early years of flight because, in fact, Churchill learned how to fly in 1913, and later that summer, the pilot who taught him died in a plane crash. So you have to have a waiver that says, I understand what I'm about to do is very dangerous, but I really want to go do it. That really lowers the cost dramatically. That's the space side. One of the other things I'm really pushing very hard for is to create a brain science approach and what I describe as Alzheimer's bonds, and take all of brain research off budget, challenge the neuroscience community to tell us what's the optimum you can invest annually, and then as they get the breakthroughs, pay off the bonds with the savings. Alzheimer's alone is a $20 trillion cost from now to 2050, public and private combined. $20 trillion, bigger than the entire national debt. That doesn't count Parkinson's, it doesn't count autism, it doesn't count mental health. And so you have a really big interest in making strategic investments in cost centers in order to eliminate the cost center. We don't pay anything for iron lungs anymore because polio vaccine eliminated it. So I think you've got to think much more strategically about really shaking up the kind of humdrum everyday models we have. We had peer research, small grant projects that really don't get you the scale of breakthrough you need.
Yeah, you talk to physicians and researchers, and they of course have to work within the system they're working within, and they do make some progress. But the degree to which I think they're making less progress than they could because of the way the FDA is set up, the NIH is set up, the peer review system, which turns out, incidentally, this is a recent study that half these peer-reviewed studies aren't really well-reviewed, or they don't really work, or they can't be replicated. The whole thing is anti-entrepreneurial, it seems.
Yeah, and it's it's a cultural style. I mean, which also means a lot of researchers spend an amazing amount of their time filling out applications
Right.
and waiting. And you want to go to a very different model. I mean, the Apollo project had no peer review small grant component. It was, this is where we're going, this is how we're going to get there. It was very large scale engineering, much closer to the Manhattan Project and things we did in World War II than anything we do today.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
you think we've made progress, but we actually couldn't do the Manhattan Project
right.
or the Apollo Project probably today.
Not without changing the law radically, which is what we should do. I mean, we should go back to what is it going to take for America to be successful, and then ruthlessly cut through all the things that stop us.
You ran to defeat President Obama in 2012. He got reelected. You weren't the nominee. Maybe you wouldn't have been reelected if you were the nominee. But let's begin with President Obama and then talk more broadly about the political system and the crisis it's in or not. But President Obama.
Well, I think what people have to come to grips with, particularly in the conservative movement, is this is one of the most consequential presidents in modern history. He set out to radically change America. In many ways, he has succeeded. Whether we can turn that back after 16, we'll see. But at least for the short run, he is in many ways like Woodrow Wilson. He has, with great ruthlessness and determination, moved in a particular direction with a particular set of values. He's often been fairly dishonest about it while he was doing it, but nonetheless, he kept grinding away. And so he will leave the country more centralized, more bureaucratic, more influenced by regulation, more left-wing in its cultural values, weaker in the world, and surrounded by a level of chaos that would have been unthinkable in 2008. And I think he'll look back and think, yeah, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted a smaller, weaker America that couldn't threaten the world. I wanted to find a way to work with people like the Iranians. I mean, none of this is it's not because he's stupid. He has a genuine model in his brain that says, I can work with the Iranians, and so they get nuclear weapons. Israel has nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Why are we picking on the Iranians? Now, you can't say that publicly. And part of this, very much like FDR and Woodrow Wilson, is when you want to radically change the country, you have to continuously lie about it, because otherwise you'd be destroyed. So all three of these presidents had a pattern of trying to move things they couldn't explain while pretending they weren't doing it. So Obama says, well, you get to keep your doctorate. We knew that wasn't true. He says, I'm really against gay marriage, which it wasn't true when he said it.
Right.
And you go down this whole line of things. But conservatives have to at least respect in an opponent the reality of what he's accomplished. I mean, you can then decide you dislike him deeply or you want to repeal much of what he's done. But you have to learn, in learning the trade, you have to say, gee, what is it he did so well, and how come he got away with all this?
And have conservatives, in your view, has the conservative movement learned that lesson? Or
Oh, I think, first of all, there was so much anger. I think that right after he was elected, there was a real desire by probably half the Republican Party to find a way to work with him, because I think there was a sense of feeling good about electing an African-American president. His inaugural address was a very centrist. It was the third. He'd given a speech in Manassas the Friday before or Saturday before the election. He gave the Grant Park speech election night, and then the inaugural address. All those sounded so terrific. Right. And then he gets with Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, and they basically say to him, run over the Republicans. So think about this alternative. He has about a $900 billion special spending package, okay? They decide they will not allow the Republicans to have a single amendment. Right. They won't allow them to be in the room writing the bill. It would have been so easy. I mean, Reagan, as you know, because you were there, Reagan would have said, out of $900 billion, we take 7, let's give 200 to the other party. You would have bought in half the Republican Party. They'd have said, hey, we're working together, this guy's reasonable. Instead, you have this sudden state of shock that this guy who's talking like he's reasonable is functionally behaving like a dictator, eliminating the Republican Party from any consideration. And that was the beginning of the depth of bitterness that has just been, expanded ever since.
Which has made it hard for people maybe to understand,
Yeah. Well, and partly because people don't want to ultimately render judgment negatively about a president of the United States. The president is so central to our cultural imagery. The Oval Office is so central. You don't want to say, this is a guy who is deliberately, methodically manipulating us to achieve goals that are so radical he can't describe them. I mean, that's a really tough judgment, and it takes a long time to get there. And I think even today, when you wake up in the morning, if you're a John Boehner or you're a Mitch McConnell, there's a part of you that thinks if the president calls, maybe this time we can get a deal.
Right.
And the fact is, as long as it's trivial, you can, and as long as it's important, you can't.
And how reversible is it?
Oh, I think if the American people want to reverse it, it's amazingly reversible. This is a country which prospers because it bankrupts easily. The Japanese had this crisis after 1989 that they had a lot of companies that were dead, but under Japanese culture, you couldn't bankrupt them because it was the equivalent of committing suicide. And so they just carried them for 30 years and crippled the entire economy. In Europe, you don't allow anybody to grow up that's marginal, and they're all protected by state banks and state systems and what have you. So you can't get the dynamics. The real dynamic in America, what Schumpeter described as creative destruction, the real dynamic in America is the willingness to let things that don't work disappear. So you're a football coach, you're 0-11. The odds are very high you won't be back next year, and you knew it at about 0-6. That's an American model. I think if we win the presidency and keep the Senate, a great deal of Obamaism will disappear within 2 or 3 years.
So the system isn't so corrupt. I don't mean in the literal sense of corrupt, or in the narrow sense of corrupt, but in the broader sense of crony capitalism and sort of the system is rigged, as people say, in a way that it can't be fixed. I mean,
no, there's a difference between Obama's policies and the system.
Okay.
I mean, whether or not you could get genuine military procurement reform past Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, and I mean, in that sense, the system, or whether or not you could actually break the Department of Education loose from the teachers union, I mean, in that sense, the system's very much like the popular disbelief in it. I mean,
right.
I think there's a bipartisan system of all the lobbyists around the city, which is in fact in the 18th century Whig model of corruption, which is not bribery, but it's the notion that you place personal gain above the interest of the country, and something which Gordon Wood wrote about brilliantly in his books on the radicalism of the American Revolution and the origins of the American Revolution. In that sense, I agree with the Gallup poll, which asked the question, do you believe there is widespread corruption in government? And 75% of the American people said yes. Well, let me give you a specific example. We wrote a book, 5 or 6 years ago, Jim Frogan and I did, called Stop Paying the Crooks, which I thought was a title of sufficient clarity that would work even in the city. It didn't mean people just shrugged it off. And our estimate was that Medicare and Medicaid between them are about $120 billion a year of theft. Just straight theft. Now, you would think that's a big enough number that, the Budget Committee ought to be trying to figure out how to get the money back, because it's $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion over a decade. And I think you find similar patterns across the whole system, where people, the disabilities program, for example, is an invitation to theft. There are case studies of doctors who will put anybody over 55 who's a high school graduate on disability on the grounds that they can't earn enough money and therefore we should take care of them. Well, it just violates the law. I mean, it's not, and so you see real depth of the system breaking down. And again, I think it's part of the country's anger and the sense that you've got to somehow blow up the system because people have this instinctive sense that it isn't working. They know people in their own neighborhood who are getting money they shouldn't be getting. They know that the game is rigged. And if you're a small business trying to do business with the Pentagon, you know the system is rigged. I think that's the underlying patterns that are there.
And I think the connection in a way with Obama or with liberalism is somehow it's rigged in such a way that liberals can move their policies forward,
sure,
and conservatives can't undo them, right, because then they're embedded precisely in a system that is...
Well, and liberals are very tolerant of corruption. I mean,
right,
so you end up with the Solyndra, for example, turned out to be the tip of an iceberg. If you were to look at the total amount of fraud involved in Obama's efforts with solar power and wind power and what have you, it's breathtaking. I mean, but nobody's ever put it together and said, look, these are patterns of fraud.
Yeah.
This isn't just an occasional, gee, they had a bad judgment. This is layer after layer of people who are thieves.
I mean, Obamacare, I think, is a good example of that, buying off different parts of the medical, health insurance and hospitals. And
look, the cynicism on both sides. I mean, the cynicism of the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical
Right.
companies, the hospitals, all of whom would like to have, they fit perfectly Adam Smith's warning in The Wealth of Nations that any meeting of producers is a conspiracy against the consumer. And we will see this play out in the next couple of years as the prices go out of control, because if you take care of everybody, you can't possibly have the competition that keeps prices down.
Right.
And all of them are going to desperately try to avoid competition.
So it's sort of the conservative task, I think. I mean, there are individual things you can do to unwind particular parts of the interlocking network of corruption, interest group, back scratching, crony capitalism, and all that. But in a way, the conservative task is somehow to cut some of the Gordian knots, right? I mean, if that's one metaphor or whatever the right one is.
Well, I think it's close to
blow.
I think it's close to Alexander, taking his sword out and saying, you're right, I'll never untie this knot, but watch.
Right.
And I think in almost every case, it means you want transparency, you want competition, you want to have a relentless sense of frankly, prosecuting people who break the law. I mean, the number of people who, when you read these things about people who filed false reports about millions of dollars in order to get, for example, government aid for solar power. And my view is you have to say the question, okay, how many of them went to jail?
Right.
Because if it is a risk-free theft, then how do you explain the 17-year-old down the street who just got picked up for, stealing a car, and his neighbor who just got picked up for lying about $40 million, and the neighbor doesn't go to jail and the kid does? I mean, that's why I think people have this deep sense that the system is out of whack and needs very dramatic reform.
And is the political process responsive, I guess, to that?
It hasn't been yet. No, I think it's fascinating to me. I've tried for about 8 years to make the case that if you took the American Express, Visa, or a MasterCard model, which is very good on fraud, and you applied it to Medicare and Medicaid, you'd probably save over $100 billion a year. You get nowhere.
Yeah, and you don't hear presidential candidates promising to do that.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And why is that, actually? I mean,
I think because there used to be a New Yorker magazine cartoon that had a desk and it had in, out, and too hard. So I think all the consultants come in and go, you're going to sound weird if you say that.
yeah.
Now, I do see some baby steps, as I said earlier. Congressman Miller passing a bill that will allow the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to fire any bureaucrat who's not serving veterans. That's actually a pretty bold and pretty big change, and we'll see what happens in the Senate. Excuse me, where I think Marco Rubio is the lead co-sponsor. And so you see the ice beginning to break. I mean, part of what's happening is the system is breaking down so badly that reasonable people are beginning to realize they need unreasonable answers.
Right.
Because no reasonable answer fits the scale of the problem.
Right.
And I'm beginning to see more and more talk in both the House and Senate, and among governors, and people like John Kasich, who was doing it in Ohio. Rick Perry, who was doing it in Texas. These were guys who were, Mitch Daniel. These are guys who were really breaking loose and really beginning to make a difference.
So you're not pessimistic about that the system somehow is you do get into these, death spiral may not be quite the right word, but, self-reinforcing mechanisms. I'm sure I think the business school people have a word for this, where, a business can't fix itself because there's the bad habits are so self-reinforcing and the incentives are so messed up and the pressure from the outside can be deflected in some way or another. Ultimately, businesses it probably can't be because they do have to, a bottom line. But government, you can deflect it for a long, long, long time, it seems.
Yeah, but I think government...
And incumbents can get themselves reelected by paying off individual groups, so they don't quite ever have to be responsible for the overall performance of the government.
I think that's true for a long time, but I think when you get to a certain critical mass of incompetence and a critical mass of corruption, the customers begin to rebel against the whole pattern.
Right.
And I think that the Tea Party movement was an early indicator of that. I think you are seeing, and in some ways our election in '94 was an indicator of that. And I think you're beginning to see a momentum in the country at large that is nobody in Washington seems to understand, but that I think reflects this underlying judgment. There was a poll the other day in Florida, and if you took Trump, Carson, Fiorina, and Cruz, and Cruz is an outsider who happens to be in the Senate, but he has no resemblance to an insider. Those four in Florida were 62% of the vote.
Yeah.
Now, I keep telling people, don't focus on the candidates, focus on the people. Because if you have 62% saying, if you're serving in elected office, you're not on my list, that is a breathtakingly big number. I mean, that number historically would have been, for Ross Perot or for Pat Buchanan, 15, 20%. I think what you're seeing is a wrestling with how do we find somebody whose characteristics allow them to really dramatically change Washington. We don't want somebody who's going to manage Washington better.
Right.
This would be an interesting test question, actually. It would be to ask, do you want somebody who can manage Washington better or somebody who can change Washington? My guess is that change wins 70-30 or 80-20.
Yeah, certainly among conservatives or Republicans.
Yeah. And of course, that's where having an incumbent Democratic president keeps most Democrats still stuck with this is okay.
Right.
But it will be interesting to watch once he's gone. I suspect if you went to the black community and said, "Are you satisfied with how things are going?" the answer would be staggeringly high, and probably in the high 80s, low 90s, that they're not satisfied. But they're not going to say that if it sounds like it's anti-Obama.
My sense is people are a little daunted by just the scope of the challenge, the scope of the necessary change. You're a historian. I mean, what could they read about from American history or other nations' histories that either about individuals or moments that would sort of both give them guidance on how to think about this and models and sort of reassure them that it can happen. It's not, the choice is not, gradual decline into stasis or, I don't know, the French Revolution or something,
No, I think there are four great examples of the American willingness to undertake really big changes. The first is Washington and the Revolution. I mean, the fact is that the odds against the Americans in 1776 were so enormous that the British, I think, were probably astounded. And they had almost beaten Washington by Christmas of 1776. I mean, it was a very. I wrote a novel with Bill Fortune called "To Try Men's Souls" about crossing the Delaware and the important role that Thomas Paine played, because Paine is writing the documents that are explaining to people what they're living through and then giving them courage. So one, I would say, though, if you take the approximately 1770 to Washington leaving in 1796, that cycle, and you said, how far did these people come?
Yeah.
It's pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, large parts of it were really hard. I mean, you couldn't predict success. The second is Lincoln. I mean, it may surprise you to know that one of the books I think best helps you understand Lincoln is by Gore Vidal, and called Lincoln. But, here's this guy who is self-educated, back to our earlier conversation on learning, who in the 1850s takes up Euclidean geometry because he wants to understand how to think about patterns, and is literally riding around with his horse going on the circuit, and the horse knew where he was going, and so Lincoln would be studying geometry as a very mature adult, and it really shapes his speaking style. Well, I mean, here's a guy who endures and wills the killing of 630,000 Americans. I mean, any morning Lincoln could have stopped the war, and he wills it. Cliff and I were down on Memorial Day looking at the Lincoln Memorial, and I get tears in my eyes. I mean, the pain that he felt because he knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
It wasn't because he was indifferent. It wasn't because he was callous. It's because he thought it was the price of freedom. the third example is the Roosevelt cycle. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt takes a country that could have gone the way of Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler. And while we on the right dislike the New Deal deeply, the fact is he recreated a sense of being American, a sense of optimism. And then he leads us through World War II and leaves us with the most powerful nation in the history of the world. Well, you look at the scale of the buildup. It is unbelievable. And then finally Reagan. I mean, Reagan comes into a country which is demoralized, where there's a movie, I can't remember the title of it now, but there's a movie about the last car that has gasoline. It's a comedy, but but it fits Jimmy Carter. We're a country that couldn't even launch a rescue mission in Iran. I mean, there was a sense of just everything falling apart, as Theodore White said. By the time of the New Hampshire primary, you literally felt between inflation and unemployment and everything else that the wheels were coming off. Reagan turns that around psychologically in weeks. I mean, the day of his inaugural, the whole thing starts to turn. And by that summer has communicated with the Soviets through two symbolic acts, shooting down two Libyan aircraft and firing the Patco strikers, that he's very tough and that he's very willing to use American power. And the world has begun to change in ways that you couldn't imagine. So I look at those and I think, I would bet on us. I think we have it still in our genetic pattern to go out and to change the world. And I fully expect the next few years are going to be sort of amazing.
And they all had a sense of the magnitude of the challenge, I guess, and told other people about it. That's your Thomas Paine. I mean, there was not a kind of, they were not playing small ball, as we say these days.
And I think whoever wins the presidency will almost certainly be somebody who rallies us to a dramatically larger, better America. And will say to us, we can't stay down here. I mean, the one great failure of Obama is that he can't get the economy to work. He can't get the government to work. He's won his policy fights, but he can't make Syria secure. He can't make Libya secure. I mean, there's this general underlying sense that at a performance level, that none of this stuff is working, which will be an enormous burden for Hillary or whoever the Democratic nominee is to carry, because they're only going to have to explain that this is good enough.
Yeah, I sometimes say in speeches that it's hard to convey to younger people what it was like, and I wasn't involved obviously in 79, 80, or 75 to 80 really, just watched that from grad school, I guess, the Kemp-Reagan revolution, which you were involved in as a junior congressman, or let's say what Giuliani did in New York in 93 when I was a little closer to that and saw that, though I didn't anticipate it, I've got to say. And the extent to which people really, the radicalness of the change that they embraced, and the willingness to break China, including conservative and Republican China,
right,
and getting there. I mean, that I think is something the current candidates don't feel like they quite have internalized that, I would say. They don't think they're Kemp and Reagan willing to take on the establishment of their own party as well as the liberal establishment, the media, and everyone else. They don't quite think they're Giuliani going to become mayor of New York and do something that most observers, including conservatives, sophisticated conservative social scientists, thought, well, you can't really reduce, maybe you can stop the growth of crime and, stabilize the situation. You can't cut, if you had said we're going to cut crime by, 70% or something in New York, people we respect a lot, and rightfully so, would have said, oh, come on, that's much too ambitious. And I guess I'm a little shocked and worried about the absence of ambition, it seems to me, among both thinkers and politicians on the right. On the left, they don't have much ambition because the ambition is to try to preside over decline and make us more like Europe, so we can be more cheerful in our decline.
I'm not. I guess I'm not sure that I am watching the same candidates that you are. I mean, I think Trump was brilliant in taking the whole notion of "Make America Great Again."
Yeah, that is Reagan's slogan.
And that's working. I mean, I think.
Good point.
That and you end up with Brady having Trump's hat in his locker. I mean, all these little things.
Right.
I think Carson, because he's so calm, people don't realize if you listen to what Carson says, he may be the most radical candidate in the race. But he says it in such a, pleasant, calm, I can do really great surgery, I can do really great presidency, that you don't realize what he's actually saying is very radical.
But what does it say that those two are not the ones who were in elected office before? And
Well, I think it's one of the challenges to the candidates who are elected. I think Kasich is capable of doing that. And if you look at what he's done in Ohio is astonishing. And he's the only incumbent governor running who has a very high popularity back home. I mean, he's still above 60% approval, which in a state like Ohio is not easy. And he has been very methodically for change. I mean, but his tends to be an enthusiast approach to change, a little more like Theodore Roosevelt than like Ronald Reagan. But it's real. I think one of the challenges that Rubio and Paul and even Cruz have had is if you have Washington as the backdrop, it's very hard to get people to accept the level of change you want to represent because they see all this noise around you.
right.
And Rubio, who's very, I think, extraordinarily smart, has the potential to do that, but I think that's where your point comes in. None of them have, it's easy to forget that by 1980, Reagan had spent a very long time, from 1947 on, communicating about communism, making speeches, doing television shows, being governor for 8 years. There was a sense of Reagan that none of these guys can possibly have because they haven't been out running around the country for 25 years.
Right.
It's actually one of Trump's advantages that he's the one character in the field whose level of celebrity status is sort of comparable to Reagan's. He's been around forever and has been a background noise forever. Although I must say that I think Carson may be, in many ways, a more interesting and bigger challenge than Trump because Carson is so quiet and he's not. It's not that he has radical policies; it's that he has radical views. So if you listen to him talk about what had happened in Baltimore with the riots, or you listen to him talk about Black Lives Matter, or you listen to him talk about the tax code, and he says very calmly, well, God thinks 10% is enough, and God doesn't think if you have a good harvest, you ought to have 30%. So maybe if everybody just paid 10%, that'd be okay. Well, if that actually becomes his proposal, it'll drive the policy elites crazy. And he says it in a way where every evangelical now is bonding with Carson because he's using a language that perfectly reflects their experience.
Yeah.
Without particularly being religious. And so, but a lot of what he says is very radical.
So you think we could have a moment like the four you've mentioned, and
I
beginning in 2016? You're
look,
going to end this conversation by cheering me up.
Well, yeah. Look, first of all, as a historian, I'm always interested when things change because there's so much more to think about.
Right.
Second, as an American, the British bet against us. The Confederacy bet against the
British
survival of the Union.
bet against us again in
The second
1816
time,
because they were kind of weren't they kind of pro-Confederate?
Yeah. The Spanish fought us, and then Kaiser Wilhelm thought we were irrelevant, and then Hitler thought that we were irrelevant, and then Khrushchev was going to bury us. And by 1985, there were books like Japan is Number One and the Emerging Japanese Superstate. So my guess is that we will once again rely on the sheer energy of 315 million people who will turn out to be better than their politicians and more engaged than their bureaucrats and better informed than their news media. And I suspect that we are at the beginning of another American century.
On that note, it's a good note to end on. Thanks a lot, Newt, for joining me today, and thank you for joining us at Conversations.